There are many things to consider when you're choosing a new garden site or planning the planting in an established garden site. With a new site, one of the most important considerations is what was there before you're going to make it into a garden. I know of situations where there's an old fence row running through the garden site that had been treated with a soil startlant to keep the weeds down. What ended up was a strip through the middle of the garden where nothing would grow. Be on the lookout for places where people have been dumping crankcase oil, other things that could interfere with the growth of the plants. Also, places that have been heavily traveled, either a sidewalk or a walkway, or where people have been parking their cars for several years. Compacted soil can be saved, but it means it's going to be a lot harder to deal with and will take longer to make a good garden soil out of it. The situation that most of you will be facing, though, when starting a new garden is established sod. Now, this is our Bermuda sod. What you see is the perennial ryegrass growing, but underneath there are Bermuda grass roots ready to start growing this spring. Probably one of the worst things you can do if you're going to start a garden would be to go into a situation like this, till it up this spring, and put it in a spring garden. You are going to be fighting Bermuda grass until you never want to see another blade of grass again. If you're just starting on a new site like this, your best steps are to wait until the Bermuda grass starts growing. That's going to be a lot later than you're going to want to wait. Hit it with Roundup herbicide to kill out the Bermuda grass, then till it up, put in a short cover crop like buckwheat or hay grazer, till that under. That should get you ready for a July planting for a fall garden. You're going to skip your spring garden, but you'll really be a whole lot further off for not having battled that Bermuda grass all summer. Now, when you're coming right into a section that's been in sod, you can have increased problems with white grubs and wireworms. So watch out for those insects as you're tilling it. If you have high populations, you may need to treat the soil. Another factor in choosing your site, you may not have much choice in your soil type, but sometimes different parts of the yard has better or worse sites. A sandy loam is your best soil. A heavier soil is fine. It just means that you're going to have to work harder at building up the organic matter, and you may have to go to some raised beds to improve the drainage. Now, there's some other factors to consider. Let's go talk about them. When you're picking the site to put the garden, watch for your trees. Two things to watch out for. One is the root competition. The roots of the trees extend to the drip line and beyond. So if you get your garden too much under the tree, you're going to have a constant battle with the tree roots to keep them out of the garden, keep them from competing with your plants. Now, the other thing to be considered about the roots is if you have a black walnut tree. Roots of black walnut have a substance in them that's highly toxic to many plants, especially tomatoes. So you don't want your garden anywhere near a black walnut tree. The other factor that trees affect is the light. Now, you'll notice our hackberry is starting to get right to the edge of our garden, and actually a little bit beyond our edge. Starting this year, or definitely next year, we're going to have to do some selective thinning on these branches to keep those branches back away from the garden, to keep them from causing excessive shade. Now, you want at least 6 hours of direct sunlight on your garden for good production. Anything less than that, and you generally are not going to get healthy plants. And even with 6 hours of direct sunlight, that's really minimum. You can't expect full production from the plants with that little light. If you have that little light, widen the spacings on your plantings to give those plants every benefit that they can, because they're running low on light. If you look at this back section of our main garden, you'll see a lot of shadow from our pine trees. Now, this is winter and our sun angle is low, and so it's casting a lot of shade. When we get into the main part of the growing season and the sun angle comes up higher in the sky, there actually is very little shade on the back section of the garden. There's some, but not enough to really affect production. But watch out for that light. Make certain you have enough. Make certain that your location is near a ready source of water. Just about any place in Oklahoma, you can count on needing irrigation during the growing season. Also, you may notice there's a bit of wind today. If you can locate your garden in a spot that's protected It will make it much easier to establish seedlings because they're not in that drying wind. Also, it's going to cut down on your water requirements during the year. If you don't have a protected site, you can plant a windbreak, even a temporary windbreak such as sweet corn or other tall growing plant will work, or put up a windbreaking structure for small areas that will work fine. One gardening technique that's really often neglected is rotation within the garden. Now in our main garden here we have 3 different sections, and we have it designed such that each one of the sections each year stays totally in cover crops. This is to build up the organic matter in our soil. With our large area, we can afford to keep a third of it out of production each year and concentrate on our 2. Crop rotation, that is not following one type of crop with the same type of crop, is very important in controlling root diseases such as verticillium, fusarium, and other root rots especially. It can also help decrease the buildup of insects that are particular to one specific crop. Now, I talk about vegetable groups. Your tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, Irish potatoes are all in the solanaceous group. Your vine crops, your cucurbits, those are your squash, melons, cucumbers. Those are in a separate group. Those all count as one. You don't want to follow cucumbers by squash because it's following by the same type. Cole crops, your broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, those are all in the same group. You want to keep those at least 3 years apart. With our 3-section cycle, that way we can keep it separated and get a good rotation on those crops, not follow them year after year. Our first section spent all of last year being cover crops, and it's been tilled under, getting ready for spring planting. Now this section is going to be our vine crops, our melon, squash, and our sweet corn. Now the far half is going to start out as sweet corn. Then when that gets done, we're going to plant our fall vine crops, mostly our winter squashes and our pumpkins. This front part is going to be our spring planted vine crops, which will be mostly your melons. Now the vine crops go in at an 8 to 10 foot spacing in between them. That leaves a lot of empty space in the middle that doesn't get used for a long period of time. We're going to come down the middles of those rows, plant English peas in early spring. They can use that space. By the time they're done, the vine crops will be just moving over to it, so they won't get in each other's way. The second section is going to be cover crops this year. The far part, the third section, is going to be all of our other crops: tomatoes, peppers, cole crops, all of our salad greens. By rotating every 3 years, and actually by switching ends that we plant the tomatoes in, we can actually get a 6-year rotation instead of a 3-year. Now, rotations, they're good preventative measures with the newer disease-resistant varieties, especially verticillium and fusarium-resistant tomatoes. It becomes less critical, but still a good sanitation practice. Now, one thing, when you look at many garden plans, they always recommend putting your tall crops on the north side so that they don't shade out the other crops. One problem with that is that you can't do any rotation, because you would have to then move the corn to the middle or eventually to the front of the garden, and then you start shading it out. To me, a better plan is to plant north-south rows instead of east-west rows, and then grow them, rotate east to west. That way, whatever's right next to the corn, what's east to it will get full morning sun. What's on the immediate west side will get full afternoon sun. So it really wouldn't be that much of a problem. When you get into raised beds and you start getting smaller, any smaller garden plot, you start running out of some of the options that you don't have as much space that you can use as in the open ground. Sweet corn, for one thing, probably not practical when you have limited space. Your vine crops take up so much space, you'll need to use some sort of space-saving technique, such as growing them up on a trellis, or every year there's a new variety of melon, squash, that has very short, compact vines, very well adapted to growing in smaller, tighter gardens, such as our raised beds here. We have 4 raised beds, so we can still do our rotations very easily. As I said, your space-saving techniques are useful in your large garden, but come into play a lot in your smaller gardens. Even if you don't even have soil that you can plant in, you can still garden. Let's go look at that. Using a wide variety of containers, you can grow vegetables on a deck or on a patio. Just make certain that it has a large enough root capacity so you don't have to water it every time you turn around. Make certain it has drainage holes, and you'll probably be using some sort of soilless mix, so you don't have to worry about soil-borne diseases. Your choices of plants to grow is much more limited. It would make no sense to grow one stalk of corn or one head of cabbage that you can buy very cheaply down at the supermarket. High-value crops, or crops that have a very high premium on freshness, such as tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, parsley, and basil, some herbs make a good container plant. Those work very well.